excusing himself, and I will assume the role of moderator also. We are one of the co-sponsors, OMSI. It's a long history to tell you the name OMSI and his background, not important here, okay? So Jimmy, let me welcome everybody. This is a unique but special event. And if I remember right, Prof. Farooq, when we last hosted one with Dr. Kuru, we were kicked and bounced around, okay? So I'm glad we are here in the safe space of Nottingham. Thank you, Dr. Rob Naim. Thank you for Nottingham for hosting us. We have a special speaker today, and you read, because we sent out the CV for all of you. I won't say too much about Prof, but he's very well recognized and now very well published in this area for public understanding. He's a professor in his own right, and you can do his research about the works he has done. But I was especially delighted to see the topic of governance of religious diversity, a new analysis. Actually, we need a new analysis because even in Malaysia, Mr. Madani defines Madani in particular ways, okay? Okay? And I have some issues and concerns, which won't be expressed here because it's not so relevant for today's topic directly, because here we want to recognize a keynote speaker who's flown and come in, and believe it or not, he's only in Malaysia for a few hours. He has to catch a plane and fly back by 1:30 today. So we're a bit rushed, but I'm sure we'll have an important time. Now I'll pass the floor to Dr. Farooq, who will say a bit more, and then I have a video that I want to show to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kejijan. Can you hear me? Sorry about this. As Dr. Kejijan mentioned just now, this is kind of collaborative effort of three organizations, namely the Islamic Advance Front, UMSI, and also the University of Nottingham. This is a second event this year after the eventful event with Prof. Kuru, and I hope that, we won't have any problems, right, today? Since you are here just for a short while, yeah. This is basically our Prof. Tariq is going to talk about his book, the New Governance of Religious Diversity. But since I've not, read this book in full, I'll just give a brief overview about this topic about multiculturalism. Yeah. What I want to say is that, how do we define this topic? It's basically, it means a lot of things, and I would simply define it as a preservation of culture distinct from that of the majority of the population that is choosing to exist within a community with similar values and making deliberate decisions to identify ourselves with the community in ways that set ourselves apart from others in our country. So the thing is that, I see as myself, say I'm Muslim and I'm living in Australia, for example. I would definitely believe that multiculturalism is still the best, the best thing to live. And Prof. Tariq, stays in the UK, and of course he believes in multiculturalism as well. So it's not about integration, because there's always a debate about this issue of whether integration or assimilation or integration and stuff like this. But I think multiculturalism is still the best at the moment, right? Yeah. So supporting multiculturalism principle is probably better, as I said, than integration. You support policies that will enable a multicultural rather than integrated society to function. Meaning to say that, whether we are from the minority group or, any groups, like in Malaysia, the Shiites, for example, do we consider them as part of our community or not? That's an issue, right? There's so many religious minorities that were persecuted in this country, and I believe that the Muslim minorities were much more persecuted than as compared to the other minorities of other religions. Next one is that my point one, it's going to be a short one. Point one is that cultural heritage is important. We should not penalize people just simply because they do not conform to the mainstream culture of a certain country. That's my point one. And point two is that assimilation expects a certain group to share their cultural heritage to adopt those of the host country. And this is going to be difficult, even for Muslims staying abroad. They wouldn't want to shed their own culture, to embrace the culture of that country, right? And if you look at this particular country in Malaysia, we have this Malay supremacy, and I think we are going to have problems with citizenship and other rights as well, right? And the third one is that allowing people to preserve their own cultures, allow other people to understand different cultural practices and way of living life. Mean to say that we need to adapt ourselves to the different cultures of other people, right? And point number four is that neither state or majority host country community has a monopoly on the knowledge of the best way to live life, right? As such, we have to seek out this good life for ourselves. It varies depending on our individual values and priorities. So we cannot say that our way of life is the best way of life. The Buddhists, they have different way of life. So we have to respect. So that's what multiculturalism is all about. And the last point that I want to make is that it allows there's a greater choice between way of living rather than everyone being integrated into one way of life that varies very little. Even in some ways of life are actively harmful, the laws exist to protect us against such excesses. For example, it's polygamy. We might not agree to it, right? But we have to have a leeway to allow some people who believe in that culture to live with it. So that's my point of multiculturalism. And with that, I think I would like to give back to Dr. K. J. John.
Thank you, Dr. Farooq. My relationship with Dr. Farooq goes back all the way to 2012, when we first hosted a forum called Who Needs the Islamic State? He spoke. We had about 300 people in the audience, and I think Siti Kasim was there as well. If you remember, you asked Nurul Izzah that question, that explosive question. Anyway, welcome. I want to now play a video, but before that, let me say something. As a Malaysian, second-generation Malaysian, born and bred in this country, born before Merdeka, I grew up thinking about all these things, from little black and white worldviews, which my mother taught me. Then I realized there are grays in all the worldviews, there are gray in between, which my mother didn't teach me. Then I moved on in life and realized the grays can explode into a rainbow of colors, which I learned in my doctoral work. So allow me to play a 12-minute video which expounds what I concluded as one way forward for Malaysia. It looks at the onion peel. I call it the onion peel model. It's going to be presented on video. Our colleague here will trigger the video, and then we can think about it when we hear the lectures.
Okay.
In the name of God, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to address my Malaysian friends from afar. Malaysia is a country which I visited often in the 80s and 90s. and to which I feel very close. And I'm very glad to be able to have these few moments to share some thoughts on a very important issue to Malaysia, namely that of integration in relation to the integrity of the communities that exist in that country for you today. The question of integration, of course, is not limited to one country like Malaysia. There are many countries in the world which have faced or face this issue. It is said in the United States, where people talk about integration of various cultures and so forth, that by some facetious commentators, of course, that the United States is a melting pot in which nothing melts. So even in a country like the United States, which is so fluid and a new culture and society, integration was, of course, not complete. It's not complete racially, ethnically, and many other ways. And in other countries, it's even less complete. We have had countries in which people have lived together for a long, long time without being integrated in an ultimate sense. We have the case of that in parts of India, in Eastern Europe, and many other places. Also, the case of Malaysia is particular because in many of those other examples that I gave, one group usually dominated completely. For example, in America, white Christians were a complete majority, absolute majority, for 2 centuries, and only now, gradually, other groups which are not white or which are not Christian are becoming major minorities, and maybe in a few decades, they will not even be a minority anymore. Or in a country like Egypt, where you have the Copts and the Muslims, both Egyptian. There has not been integration, but the proportion is very different. There are 90 to 91% of all Egyptians are Muslims, 8 to 9% are Coptic Christians, or Catholic Christians, mostly Coptic Christians. In the case of Malaysia, you have a very special situation. The Malay world, when it was called Malaya in the 19th century, was inhabited by the Malay people. That's why it was called Malaya. But during the colonial period, going back even before the 19th century, but especially from the 19th century onward, the British, in order to dilute the Malay population, caused a great deal of migration of non-Malays into Malaysia, especially from the Chinese world, but also from India. And so once Malaysia was founded as a national state, the Malays who were Muslims were not an 80-90% majority. They were only about a 55% majority, a little bit over half of the population of the country. And so the challenge has remained for Malaysia how to integrate the country, which is a thriving modern national state, while having a population that is religiously distinct to this extent, in which 45% or 43% of the population is non-Muslim and is considered to be non-Malay, because in Malaysia oftentimes the word Malay is identified with a religion rather than with ethnicity. The case of Malaysia poses this very special situation, and it's very important therefore to try to seek integration without destroying the various forces, elements which have created Malaysia, this vibrant society which is doing so well in so many ways, economically and otherwise, and to some extent intellectually. It's a very important question. I think the first issue that must be addressed is that integration does not mean dissolution of identities necessarily. I've seen this in various periods of history, for example, in the classical period in the Islamic world, where the vast majority were Muslims, Christians and Jews had their own identity religiously, but there was a great deal of integration into the society as a whole. And we have seen that case also in India and other places. So the case of Malaysia poses this very important problem. How can each of the groups which are not Malay, either religiously or ethnically, preserve their integrity and yet have a unified nation? My colleague and friend Dr. John has mentioned 5 layers of meaning related to this question of integrity and integration, especially the question of identification, which makes possible integrity and integration both. The first is that you have a national nation state and nationality identity. This is quite obvious, every country does. And every country, let's say you're in India, you might be Hindu or a Muslim, but you call yourself an Indian, or in the United States, you might be a Jew or Christian, you call yourself American. Now, that's quite obvious, and that exists in Malaysia. Malaysia has been able, since independence, to create a sense of national identity quite well, and it's a very important nation state in Asia today. Then the question of ethnic and cultural heritage. Now, in this domain, there's of course a great deal of difference between especially the heritage of the Chinese who migrated to the Malay world and local Malays, and those who migrated from India, and the few who migrated from the Persian Gulf and Hadramaut to the Malay world and brought Islam there. They're very, very different cultural background and ethnic also, because we have at least 3-4 different racial ethnic groups. The Malay group itself, which is dominant, the Indian group, the subcontinent of India, the Chinese, and then there are a few from the Middle East and the Arab-Persian world, especially the Arab world. So you have actually a distinct and disparate pattern of ethnicity and cultural heritage, which is also there, and they all respect their cultural heritage. And the goal of the state to integrate is to accept that heritage and to accept that each follower of one of these cultures feels attached to that culture and holds that in honor and value. Then there's a legacy of hereditary belief system. This is a way of talking about religion. Religion is not only a legacy, it's living also, because legacies are something of the past. And you have a living situation in which you have Muslims in Malaysia, many of whom are very pious Muslims, very devout Muslims. You have 10% Indians who are Christians. Then you have a large number of Chinese who either have become converted to Christianity or follow the Confucian Taoist tradition. And so you have actually a mixture of various religions, and there's no way to integrate those except to create accord between them, which is one of the great tasks of today in the 20th century, 21st century, it began in the 20th century, to create accord between religions, something about which I've been speaking and writing for 50 years, and to create harmony and accord and understanding between the various religions. In Malaysia, I've often said that the traditional view of the perennial philosophy, which I hold, which considers the transcendent unity of religions inwardly and diversity on the outward level to bring religions together, has its most important application immediately in Malaysia, where all these religions exist side by side, and they're not died, they're not secularized, and most of the followers still follow the religions closely. Then Dr. John speaks about psychological personal profile. That's also, of course, to some extent true. Integration is easier for some than for others. Some have greater need of local community support with which to identify, some have less so. But there's no doubt that there is a spectrum within every society as far as this issue is concerned of a psychological need. There's always psychological need for identity, but whether this is going to be only with me and my cousins and my neighbors, or the core of the city, or the whole country, or the whole world, different from human being to human being. And in this domain, Malaysia is no different from any other country in the world. And finally, Dr. John mentions human dignity or rational human consciousness. Of course, the preservation of human dignity is why we're talking about integration. Integration is integration with integrity. Integration is not simply a crushing and reducing to the lowest common denominator of everything. That would be against human dignity against human values. When we talk about integration with dignity, it's precisely to preserve the integrity and dignity of each human being. How can a Malay in Kuala Lumpur, who is a Muslim, but also a Malay who is a Christian, or a Hindu, or a Confucian, or a Taoist, and who looks different from the Malay, live in integrity, live not only safely, but feel that he or she belongs to that society with integrity. This is the great challenge that Malaysia faces. It's a challenge that all countries today, with the rise of exclusivism, both in East and West in different forms, whether it be Western Islamophobia or fundamentalism in the Islamic and Hindu worlds and other places in the world face. I hope and pray for Malaysia, which has always been one of my favorite countries in the Islamic world, that it will succeed in this very important task. My prayers are with you, and all I can say as a humble scholar of Islam is that the future of Malaysia as a vibrant culture and country depends on its being able to integrate with integrity. May God be with us.
Thank you. Now we invite Prof. Tariq to make his presentation. It's a full presentation, so after that we'll have discussion.
Can't I speak it to here?
Yes, you can. Can you just click Prof.
Great. Oh, I see, yeah. Great, thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much to Dr. Farooq Musa and Dr. KJ John for organizing at very short notice this event, and to the University of Malaysia for hosting it. In fact, my friend, Professor Catherine Adderley, in political science at the University of Nottingham, England, asked me to say hello to any of her friends who should be here from the University of Nottingham. Thank you all. Thank you for being here. I know it's not a convenient time. If I'd had to go to an event like this, I wouldn't have wanted to. I'd rather go there and speak than go and listen and disrupt my family Sunday and so on. And of course, I regret that this is taking place at the time of Christian worship. But as was mentioned earlier, I'm here for just a few hours, and this is the only time we could fit in with the rest of my schedule. It is my first, and I certainly hope not my last, visit to Kuala Lumpur and Malaysia. So, as you heard, I have a new book, and that's what I want to really tell you about, and to hear any responses that you have. It's a book co-authored by a former PhD student and research assistant of mine, Thomas Seeley, who now is a lecturer in his own right at the University of Bristol. The book is based on a project called GREASE, which stands for Radicalization, Secularism, and the Governance of Religion, bringing together diverse perspectives. The project took place between 2018 and 2020. It was led by Anatrian Defilidu and I, funded by the European Union Horizon 2020 program, and it had more than 10 partners. We studied initially 23, partially expanded to 26 countries in 4 regions: Europe, MENA, meaning Middle East and North Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Australia. We've got many publications across the two strands of the project. Radicalization, that's one strand. The governance of religion, which is the one I was mainly working on. That's the cover of the book, and that's what it looks like in real life. We offer a new theoretical framework. And in this talk, this is what I'm going to do, tell you about the theoretical framework and tell you about some of the countries as we understand them in two regions, Western Europe and your region, South and Southeast Asia. One of the distinctive features of my work and of this book is that it is interdisciplinary. It works with two disciplines, namely comparative political science or sociology and normative political theory. And you'll get that. Now, the publisher has made a 30% discount. The publisher is called Polity Books. If you use the code on their website at the bottom, can you see? MOS30, sorry, MOS30. And I've got some flyers. If you'd like one, come up to the front at the end. So let's begin with the theoretical framework. Now, we don't begin with a paradigmatic framework, which is quite typical in Western countries. They either begin with US liberal religious freedom, or alternatively, some people begin with French secularism. The French call their secularism laïcité. We don't do that. We say, look, there are multiple secularisms. And I ought to briefly say, to avoid any misunderstanding, that my book and my work on secularism is only about political secularism. So secularism can be about metaphysics. Does God exist? Is there life after death? Are we just atoms and molecules? My book's not about that. Secularism can be about personal lifestyle. My book's not about that. My book is about politics. Political secularism, which means the relationship between the state and organized religion. So if there are multiple secularisms, and there are across the world, all different kinds of secularisms, how do we get a theoretical handle on them? So we start with a minimal definition, and then we build up actual cases. Our minimal definition is given there. I'll read it out. So secularism consists of the idea of political autonomy, namely that politics or the state has a raison d'etre of its own and should not be subordinated to religious authority, religious purposes, or religious reasons. Okay? And as I say at the bottom, you might call this one-way autonomy. It's one way because it doesn't grant religion an autonomy. And in liberal secularism, usually people talk about two-way autonomy. The autonomy of the state and the autonomy of religion. And that's fine. I'm not against that. But that is a particular version of secularism. It's not all secularism. Because what about, for instance, the former Soviet Union, China, where religion is persecuted and not given autonomy? They're surely secular states. So we need a much thinner, wider concept of political secularism, and then we can build up different kinds of secularism. Liberal secularism, French secularism, Malaysian secularism, if you like, or British, or whatever. So that's why I say we begin with a very minimal definition. Our unit of analysis is a country or a polity. Well, that's quite standard. But what is not so standard is how we go about the analysis. Our focus is not on constitutions or laws, power relations, nor mere discourse or concepts, but on what we call operative norms. Norms that can be identified as actually governing the politics of a country, regardless of what the Constitution says, regardless of what politicians say they're doing. Norms that can be shown to be in operation in that society, in that country. For example, a norm of religious freedom, or for example, a norm that religions are free to do certain things and not other things. For example, interfere in politics. That's a norm that varies considerably across countries. It's quite different in Britain, to France, to the United States, let alone so many other countries. So not all of them are secular countries, but the norms that constitute the kind of secular state that they are vary. And we look at norms into two categories. Dominant operative norms, or what we call DONs. And so DONs are the ones that do most of the work or constitute the center of gravity. They may not be a law, but they can be, of course. You know, we're not ruling out laws, far from it, but we're saying norms don't have to be enacted into law or constitutions, and they can still be quite dominant. But then there's another set of norms that we call qualifying operative norms that are also at work influencing what actually happens in practice, but they're not as powerful, but they're still present. So we look at both of them. So just to reiterate, as I do at the bottom, these norms aren't to do with legal status. They're a product of history and can fade away and change over time. That's what I mean by contingent, that they're a product of history. And you can have different combinations of dons and quans over time. They shift. They're not static. There's not a single model like the Malaysian model that will always be the same, or the British model. They change over time. Okay, so now to tell you something about the 5 modes that we have identified and we work with. So this is really now at the heart of our study. So in relation to our 26 countries, the norms clustered to delineate 5 ideal types, or what we call modes for the governance of religious diversity. So I've got 3 on this slide, and then I'll tell you about the remaining 2. So the first one we call majoritarian nationalism. What are the dominant norms in this mode? Okay, they're on the slide. Strong state identification with one religion. May or may not include toleration for other religions. May or may not include personal religious laws, by which I mean there could be personal religious laws, but they don't have to be. For that mode, majoritarian nationalism, sometimes there are, sometimes there are not. In radical cases, the state takes over or controls the institutions and followers of one or more religions. For example, in Turkey, the state, the Diyanet, really controls Sunni Islam to a very significant extent. The state may come to be controlled by religious parties. For example, like the AKP in Turkey, or Muslim Brotherhood. If it doesn't control the state, may try to control the state. and sometimes may take theocratic aspects, though actually that's not common and was not present in any of our 26 countries. Probably only Iran, really, is an example of a theocratic country with majoritarian nationalism. Most majoritarian nationalism is not theocratic. So what we found was that this majoritarian nationalism was the most prevalent mode in relation to Muslim majority countries, especially in MENA, Middle East and North Africa. The second mode, secularist statism. So this is where the state has control of religion. The state excludes religion from the political and the civic, confining religious freedom largely to the private sphere. This mode of secularism may be self-defined as part of the national identity of a country. It may include some support of some religions, but religion is mainly seen as belonging to the private sphere. And perhaps you recognize that's really a description of France. France best fits that mode, secularist statism. Our third mode at the bottom is liberal neutralism. That consists of moral individualism or freedom of conscience. It's anti-assimilation and equal civic standing of all religions. So it doesn't try to make all religions assimilate to one pattern. All religions are officially and socially tolerated. There is active de-othering. Now, by de-othering, I mean anti-discrimination, anti-stereotype, not tolerating some people making demonizing or what we call othering some other religion, typically a minority religion, saying you don't really belong here, you are an other, you belong somewhere else, not here. So in this mode, there's active de-othering. It doesn't tolerate othering. But there is no recognition. The state doesn't recognize any religions as having any importance in relation to itself or in relationship to society generally. It just basically takes the view, may you flourish, but we don't want to have anything to do with you. It's what we might call hands-off neutralism. The state is inactive. It is neutral between all religions. Okay, so that's three modes, which means I have two more to tell you about, which is these two. And those two are the ones I'm going to then talk about in the rest of my talk, which is what we focus on in the book. Moderate secularism is the main mode of Western Europe. It consists of moral individualism, freedom of conscience. Of course, as you will have noticed, some of these norms are part of more than one mode. So it isn't the case that every norm has to belong to one mode. Not at all. There's lots of overlaps. So moral individualism, freedom of conscience. Religions may enjoy equal or unequal status, but all are officially and socially tolerated. Religion is seen as a public good in need of support. For example, the funding of faith schools, the funding out of state funds. Religion might also be seen as in need of regulation. And I've got some examples here from Britain, really, where the government looks to the Church of England to match what they see as prevailing values. For example, issues of women bishops or single-sex marriage. The politicians are very keen that the Church of England should go in that direction, as it indeed is doing, but, there's some pressure. Also, I've got another example, encouraging social attitudes or discouraging social attitudes that undermine tolerance and respect for religion and religious diversity, and so on. So this is why the state may get involved with some religions. There's mutual autonomy, by which I mean two-way autonomy, not just one-way autonomy, two-way autonomy, but there's restricted neutrality. So can include, for example, weak establishment. By establishment, perhaps a term you're familiar with, perhaps not. By establishment, I mean like a state religion, what some people might call a state religion. So for instance, the Church of England in Britain is the church linked to the British state, to the United Kingdom. That's what I mean by establishment. And I call it weak. It's a very weak establishment. And it's quite possible with moderate secularism to have, but there can be unequal recognition. Not all religions are equally recognized, which is again true of Britain. Religious and non-religious citizens give each other generally accessible or dialogical reasons in politics. So they find ways of talking to each other without too much difficulty. And then the last mode, which I call pluralistic nationalism or unity in diversity nationalism. So here we have a norm of difference-sensitive identity recognition. Here, groups' identities, religious groups' identities, is very important and recognized. And there's institutional accommodation of religious diversity. To use a phrase used by Alfred Stepan, there is an idea that there should be respect all religions, positive cooperation amongst all religions, but principled distance. That's what the state should be doing. Respect all, positive cooperation, principled distance. And religion is active and present in public and political life. There's policy cooperation. Religious reasons sometimes are appealed to in the political sphere. Accommodative of differentiated legal status. For example, religious personal laws, like Muslim laws, are accommodated. And there is primacy of group rather than individual autonomy, and there's social support for deep diversity. This is really an ideal type that I think works best with India. This is really what I'm thinking about most with that mode, but I think it also matches to some extent, not a perfect fit, but matches to some extent your country, Malaysia and Indonesia. Okay, so that's our 5 modes. Let me say a little bit about some countries. Now, last night I was looking over my talk and I realized something slightly odd. I prepared this talk initially for an American audience. So I gave this talk a few weeks ago in the United States. And as I was looking it over last night, I realized I didn't say anything about Malaysia. Lots of other countries, but not Malaysia. So I thought, oh, it's too late to do anything about it now. You know, it's totally jet-lagged after 24 hours of travel. So I just thought, well, actually, let's make a virtue of that. I can present to you my theoretical framework, and then we can have a discussion about to what extent Malaysia does or does not fit into my theory. Anyway, I'll begin. Oops, there you go. I'll begin with Western Europe. Sorry. Begin with Western Europe. So, if we look at secularist statism, for shortness of time, I won't go through all of this, but just illustrate that France actually is a very good example of secularist statism. And one of the things we do with our model is we look at change, at movement. And so the movement in France at the moment is actually a harder and harder laïcité, mainly against Islam. That is the movement over the last couple of decades in France. Then moderate secularism can be illustrated by an example like Britain, which, as I said, has an established church, which means that the church is linked to the monarchy and the House of Lords, which is our second chamber in Parliament. We have state-funded faith schools, but we have no religion in politics, unlike the United States. And we have no funding of cathedrals, unlike France. So we're quite different in all kinds of ways. And yet we do also accommodate minority religions much more than many other countries, in schools, in public services, in relation to the police, for instance. So our police uniforms can be multi-faith uniforms. You can have a police uniform with a Sikh turban or a Muslim hijab and so on. So this mode in Britain is beginning to accommodate diversity. It's not necessarily a very diverse mode, but it can move in that direction. And that's exactly what's happening in Britain. It's beginning to move in that direction. We have a multiculturalizing of moderate secularism. Another example I give also within moderate secularism is of Germany. But again, to save time, I won't go into any details. Obviously, they're in the book, and also happy to leave my slides behind if anyone would like to look at them in more detail. So let me then move to this region of the world, South and Southeast Asia. So we think that pluralistic nationalism is a mode, an ideal type, which helps to understand what is actually happening in particular countries. So no one country is a perfect match with a mode. It doesn't work like that. The modes are analytical construct to help us understand different countries. So India is an example of a country that has a secular constitution, but is highly accommodative of minority religions. For example, there's Muslim personal law, which is supported by the state. Religion and diversity is a feature of public life, a very big, evident feature. And the nation is regarded as a unity of diversity, a phrase that I think comes from Gandhi, a unity of diversity, and in particular, a unity of religious diversity. There is individual freedom, but each minority religion is free to organize individuals. And I've got here, for example, the Shah Banu case, which you may have heard of. So this is a case that goes back to the 1980s. So Shah Banu was a divorced Muslim woman, and her husband said, okay, you can have this small amount of money as part of the divorce settlement, which is in conformity with Islam. And the Muslim council, the Sharia council, said, yes, that's true. But she said, no, this is too small. Indian civil law insists that you give a divorced wife, a divorced woman, a much larger amount of money or property or whatever. So she took her husband and, in fact, the Muslim council to court. And the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. This is in the 1980s. And the Supreme Court of India said that actually she was wrong. That Muslim personal law prevailed in her case above Indian civil law. So a lot of Indians were shocked, especially, educated secularists and so on. They were shocked that this should be the case. And since that was one of the first major public controversies to raise the question of what does secularism and religious equality mean in India, something which is unsettled, which is still carrying on. And of course, so much has happened since, including, of course, the BJP, Modi, Hindutva, and so on. Going to the third bullet point, yet at the same time, So I talk about, pluralistic nationalism, unity and diversity. Yet at the same time, we have recurrent communal violence against Muslims, and now at a pogrom-like scale, hate speech and discrimination has become normalized. We have Hindutva, BJP, Modi, the destruction of the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya, and now the creation of this new temple on that same site. And Modi had in his latest manifesto that he fought the election on, which he didn't do as well as he hoped, everyone thought he would do, but he had in his manifesto that he would repeal Muslim family law. This may not now be repealed because he doesn't have that much strength in parliament. So here we have a very strong movement towards majoritarian nationalism. But basically, India is a country that is best understood in terms of pluralistic nationalism, but it's not static. It doesn't mean it'll stay like that forever. And at the moment, it's being pushed towards some degree or other majoritarian nationalism. So we're getting a combination of pluralistic nationalism and majoritarian nationalism, combining, conflicting. Okay, another example. This time, Indonesia. So, Pancasila, the unity of God, is the national philosophy. Probably you guys know a lot more about this than I do, of Indonesia, with 6 religions officially recognized under a Ministry of Religious Affairs, and their holy days are recognized as national holidays. Everyone must have a public religious identity. I think the same here in Malaysia. But not any religious identity, a religious identity out of the 6 that are officially recognized. No one can be an atheist, or as we now say in the West, a none, because when you're ticking a box list, at the bottom it says none. And now we have, in Britain now we have about half the population ticking none. And the direction of travel is exactly the same across all of Europe and the United States. And yet, we also have, over the last couple of decades, Islamicization movements. That is to say, movements which want some version or other of an Islamic state. They haven't captured the central state in Indonesia, but they can be a force in certain parts of the country, and a force for intolerance against what they call deviant Islam and other minorities. So again, in Indonesia, we have a country that can be understood in terms of pluralistic nationalism, but the movement is towards more majoritarian nationalism. So how should we evaluate the multiplicity of cases? So we don't just describe what's happening in the world, we do have our own normative philosophy, as it were, normative viewpoint. Liberals tend to begin with individual freedom based on state neutrality, though some liberals have begun to move away from that. We suggest not just individual freedom, but respect for religion. What kind of respect? Well, how do we respect other kinds of group identities? The contemporary idea of respect, especially in quite a lot of countries, is the idea of recognition and institutional accommodation. You recognize groups as legitimate aspects of your country and of your society, especially if they've been marginalized or discriminated against or oppressed in the past, or especially recent past. Because this idea of respect is, which is part of multicultural respect, is really about equality. Not just equality as sameness, which is, if you like, the liberal classical idea. Everybody should be treated the same. Yeah, of course, that's right. But that's not all. That's not all of equality. That's the basic of equality. But multiculturalism says we must also respect difference, sameness and difference. We mustn't make the two enemies. We must extend our concept of equality to confer respect for different groups, not just sameness across individuals. People should not just be free to have these group identities, but to have them publicly recognized and accommodated and supported by the state through laws, policies, resources, whatever may be appropriate, supported in different ways. For example, take a very simple example, the provision of halal meat. This should be made available in schools, state schools, should be made available in workplaces, should be made available, for instance, on public transport, and so on. So we argue for something that we call multicultural secularism, rather than just individual freedom as our normative, our evaluative position. And the most important part of this multicultural secularism is really that there should be positive identity inclusion. Sorry, yeah, at the bottom, positive identity inclusion. Basically, this is our understanding of multiculturalism, which we think we apply to secularism by multiculturalizing secularism. However, we think that there are two very important principles that we want to emphasize and offer in relation to multicultural secularism. And this is what we do in the book. Principle number one, we call principle of identification. The state should strive to enable citizens to identify with their political community. Such identification is good for both intrinsic and instrumental reasons. Intrinsic, because, citizens benefit from being able to identify with their political community. That is to say, it's good for individuals to feel that they're part of that community. And Professor Vali Nassau was talking about that in his talk. There are instrumental reasons as well for identification to be promoted. If everyone can identify with their polity, it's easier for certain goals to be achieved. For example, public order, civil peace, security, anti-extremism, and so on. So that's the first principle, the principle of identification, okay, which is stated right at the very top. The state should strive to enable citizens to identify with their political community. So that's the first principle of multicultural secularism, out of two. So that's first, and this is the second. The principle of discretionary recognition, which is that a state may give additional recognition to one or more religions. That is to say, it may do above that level required for identification. So the state must ensure a level of recognition that enables all religious groups and their members to feel an identification with their state, whether it's India or Britain or Malaysia. But a state may do more than that in relation to one or more religions, more than is necessary for identification. Why? Why might it do that? Well, a variety of reasons may be given for such discretionary recognition, and I mentioned those in bold. Historic importance, significance for identity, especially national identity, social contribution. And I give two examples where I think this happens in different parts of the world. The Church of England has a degree of recognition that goes way beyond the recognition that any other religion has in Britain. Sunni Islam has recognition in Muslim majority countries way beyond what other religions have. So what I'm saying is that that is justifiable in multicultural secularism. But there's more to be said before we can say it is justifiable. And this is very important. There's a lexical priority. What do I mean by lexical? Well, in a dictionary or, in an alphabet, A always comes before B. Okay? You can't put B in front of A. That would be wrong. So A always comes before B. So that's lexical. So a lexical priority is that the first principle over the second principle. So the first principle is the principle of identification. The state must strive to enable all citizens to identify with their polity. That always has priority over the second, the discretionary recognition. But discretionary recognition, therefore, is impermissible if it threatens identification. So identification is the foundation. It mustn't be threatened. If it is threatened, then you can't have discretionary recognition. You must change it so that it doesn't threaten identification. But granting the former, meaning discretionary recognition, doesn't necessarily undermine the latter. Do you see what I mean? So identification must always come first and must always be assured before we can go to discretionary recognition. But we can go to discretionary recognition. Multiculturalism is not against discretionary recognition. I'm saying it's quite consistent with it, as long as there's a good reason for it, and as long as it doesn't threaten the basic principle of identification. So, if and when it does not undermine the latter, then it can be established through democratic dialogue. Then discretionary recognition can be legitimate. So a virtue of our position is that any special or privileged recognition must be a matter of democratic debate. And our position is compatible with, and so leaves open for debate, a number of options. It's compatible with mono, meaning just one, or multi-establishment. And it's compatible with no establishment. So we're saying that multicultural secularism doesn't mean no establishment, it doesn't mean multi-establishment, it doesn't mean mono-establishment, necessarily. It is possible that it's compatible with all of them, as long as the principle of identification is not undermined. So what distinguishes us is that we do not hold either of these two positions, A or B. We don't say, in a multicultural secular democracy, mono-establishment can never be justified, which is what some people say, like Will Kimlicka, who's perhaps the best-known liberal theorist of multiculturalism. And we don't say B, which is that in a multicultural secular democracy, differential recognition, and the recognition can be symbolic or legal or resource provision or any combination of them. We don't say that differential recognition can never be justified. So when everybody says there should be equal recognition, we say, well, recognition is part of equality, but it doesn't mean that the recognition has to be the same for all religions. Hence our two principles, identification and discretionary recognition. So we don't say A and B are correct, the opposite. We say, no, it depends on historic importance, significance for national identity, social contribution, etc. And all these are open matters for debate, and the debate can go differently in different countries. There's no one correct answer. So, to finish, what are the political implications of this theoretical position that I've just described? So, firstly, we think that both moderate secularism and pluralistic nationalism need to work harder to achieve the principle of identification, because we see that that is being undermined in countries like India and so many other countries as well. And we see that there is not enough of pluralistic recognition in countries like Britain. So we say that moderate secularism needs to be thickened so as to include minorities as respected equals. Okay, so that's one political implication. Our second political implication is we say that pluralistic nationalism needs to be thinned. So in a way, it's exactly the opposite of what we say about moderate secularism. Moderate secularism needs to be thickened. Pluralistic nationalism needs to be thinned to allow more individual freedom, to better defend the rights of minorities, to lessen religious domination and state authoritarianism. Again, India is a very good example, but actually most Muslim majority societies are very good examples of what I've just said. To the extent that that happens, each mode, that's to say moderate secularism and pluralistic nationalism, because we're not trying to reduce them to one perfect mode, they can remain their own distinctive modes. Each mode can exercise discretionary recognition if supported by a democratic consensus. So I haven't said anything about Malaysia. Very happy to discuss the implications, the theoretical framework, the analysis of specific countries, and the political implications. Very happy to discuss that in relation to Malaysia with you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. I really think it was a very eloquent, clear, and challenging for all Malaysians, because we could recognize Malaysia in all of those writings. So, let's start the dialogue. Prof, do you want to add anything? No. One thought comes to my mind. When I was working on this, my thesis, which was really justifying individual freedom of thought defined in all of these systems, personal, because my concern was, I was doing my doctorate in US, and all of the English language capitalizes the personal pronoun I. We never write I in small italics, right? Saya we can, aku we can, but I we don't. So I was reflecting on that, and then I came out with my thesis conclusion with three words. Thou, we, I, but small I. Okay, the thou we all recognize, I and thou, you know. The we, I and we. Zioni also wrote about that. The small I, not found anywhere else. But I said we in Asia recognize society as the we. And very often individuals lose their rights because state secularism is enforced by a majority way of life. And I think India today is a good example, and I'm glad that Modi got his slap through the election. But that's the democratic process you're talking about. So my question is there a difference between Asia today, where the we is always bigger than the I? We think as we people. We don't think an I person. You know, but the I idea is a very modern idea, which came about with democracy and one person, one vote. And yet we realize that our vote is diluted in the way the system is run. So the question is there really a difference Or are we going to end up, as in Malaysia, with a unity government where they all say they all believe in all of this and get along somehow?
Right, so I think there are two different questions there. So the second question is what may happen in Malaysia, or what may happen in Britain or India and so on. So that's obviously quite difficult to generalize. Oh, sorry, yes. Is that better? So what I started off by saying was that there are two different questions in what Dr. D. John's just been saying, asking. One is what happens in different countries, and let's park that for a moment because that depends on detail. But the more general question that you pose is, are there different ways of thinking and organizing societies between what we might call Asia or the East and the West? And of course, just talking about secularism, I mean, there are obviously loads of other differences as well, but just confining it to this topic, we want to say, yes, there are differences, and that's why we shouldn't impose a Western mode like liberal secularism on societies that have their own, as it were, ecology, their own way of thinking and working with its own, if you like, checks and balances, which of course can break apart, fall down. I mean, things don't always work. But nevertheless, we begin with the idea of multiple secularisms. And so as you saw, the principal distinction that we're focusing on between moderate secularism, which is very much based around individual freedom, of conscience, of belief, and to some extent practice, but practice is more controlled, but also about the public good. And in a way, it's the state that determines what the public good is, but through a democratic process, hopefully. And nevertheless, the center of gravity of that mode is the individual, the rights of the individual. Whereas in what we call pluralistic nationalism, you have societies that have much deeper diversity than anywhere in Europe or the United States, even though, you know, in the United States and Europe, diversity has become a kind of political motto. Nevertheless, obviously, they don't have the kind of historic diversity going back centuries, if not even millennia, that exists in parts of Asia. And again, you know, India is really perhaps the best example, where people recognize each other as individuals, but they also recognize each other as bearers of group identities, of communities and traditions, and they don't think that is a threat. In the West, to identify difference is to identify some kind of problem or threat, whereas many Asian countries have lived with degrees of harmony, as well as sometimes breakdown and conflict as well. It's not been paradise. But difference is not necessarily a threat. Difference is part of the world, part of society. And so you find ways to make society work. So I think that is the fundamental difference between a way of thinking and living which puts the primacy on the individual and individual rights, and which is now having to come to terms with post-immigration diversity, and on the other side, a historic, deep social diversity which can live with difference, which can soften the boundaries of difference. In India, again, it used to be the case that many communities come together to celebrate the religious festivals of any one community. So Ganpati, a Hindu festival celebrating Ganesh, in places like Bombay, many Muslims used to participate in that. Sometimes they didn't even know what they were participating in. All they knew is, hey, it's a day off. So the state makes it a day off for everybody. Everybody participates through streets, through neighborhoods, through families, through schools. It's just part of the social scene. Unfortunately, that is being ripped apart through a very heavy, toxic philosophy. And to some extent, this has also been happening in Muslim majority countries as well. So I don't want to single out as if it's just a Hindu problem. Far from it. In some ways, you could say Muslims have even led the way. So, not in India, I mean in general, across the globe. So it's a shame that countries that have historic diversity are now struggling to translate that historic diversity into what one might say modern political democratic ways of living and working, which are respectful of the individual and respectful of community membership.
Thank you. Thank you. Good time to ask, yes, our famous Siti Kasim.
Thank you.
Siti, take the yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Tariq, for your explanation. Really appreciate that. I learned a lot of things today. But I just want to say that your suggestion that Malaysia may be in number 5, which I believe it stands for Pluralistic, Unity, Diversity, Nationalism, maybe fall under that, is not happening. Actually, we are more to majoritarian nationalism. That's where we are right now. We have problem in Malaysia because religion has been used by the politician. Nothing wrong with religion, but it is been abused and used by our religion. The problems that we have is that the question will be under what category you would put after all these. I've listed down the problems that we have. We have a covert move by religiously related organizations and individuals to convert as many as they can into their Islam, their version of Islam. Yeah? And then number 2, one of the problems is once you are a Muslim in Malaysia, there is no way out. You are trapped in it. Okay, and basically they only recognize one version of Islam. They don't recognize Shia, they don't recognize Ahmadiyya, they don't recognize anyone else but their version of Islam, which is this one. And we have number 3, we have government policies which are biased towards a religion and a race. So there's no way we are ever going to become what we want to be, in the sense of a progressive country, for as long as our politicians keep on using and abusing and condoning actions which are not good for the development of the nation as a whole. So I don't know which category you would put us, but we have a serious problem in Malaysia with regards to religious diversities and all that. Even I am a Muslim, but people say I'm a murtad because I don't look like a Muslim, because I don't actually conform to their idea of Islam, that I must wear a hijab, that I must not speak so loudly. So this is their problem. They cannot accept me as an individual. Although I am very much a Muslim, I believe in God, I believe in Allah, I believe in everything the Quran says. maybe not the Habis not so much, and that is a problem as well. So it's a very big problem, and I'm not saying we are going to get better. You can ask the non-Muslims, they may not say it publicly, but they are being pushed out. And Muslims like me, we are being pushed out as well, because only the version of the official version, of the government, which is considered as acceptable. And I'm glad that the Indian case, Moha, proved that it is so unfair for women under the so-called Islamic law man-made by human. When the secular law are much more fair to women. There's so many much I can tell you about what's going on in our Sharia courts with regards to the rights of women and children. So many people do not receive the justice that they deserve, women especially. So where do you put us under? I think we are very much more close to majoritarian nationalism. In fact, we are heading that way if nothing is being done. Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, thank you. So, I don't fundamentally disagree with what you said, and of course I recognize that you are speaking from a depth of experience about Malaysia that I can't possibly to match. But let me just slightly broaden out what you're saying into a slightly larger picture so that I can agree with it in a slightly qualified way. So Malaysia has a foundational philosophy, Rahun Nagara. Not that old, 50 years or so old, which isn't a long time in the history of nations. And that itself was a kind of an expression of a historic social position of the politically disenfranchised under obviously British colonial rule, a recognition of a certain kind of diversity, but also, of course, it was a nation-building principles, a nation-building project. Again, just like India, and some effort was made, especially in, say, the first couple of decades after it was founded, so the 1970s, 1980s, perhaps even into the 1990s, to try and give it some substance to build that kind of pluralistic nationalism out of the social materials that existed. But at the same time, that has been partly, or more than partly, largely perhaps, from what you'd certainly say largely eclipsed by a new kind of movement, a certain kind of Islamicist movement, a certain kind of Islamicist nationalism, especially from the 1990s onwards, which challenges it both ideologically and in terms of certain kinds of institutional practice, like the status of the Sharia courts, which obviously have become more empowered by the federal government and the federal courts, and to some extent, again, relating to what you say, by politicians, if you like, pandering to perhaps a certain kind of prejudice, certain kinds of agitation. But even then, you still have in contestation these two different things. The aspiration for a unity in diversity nationalism and the more majoritarian Islamicist nationalism. And it may be that the latter is winning at the moment, as it is in so many other places in the world. But we do need to have a slightly bigger picture rather than just the present moment, because things can change. They can go in new directions, or new opportunities can emerge. I mean, and you've certainly had some newness in your politics in the last few years, haven't you? So it all seemed to be going one way, and you've managed to turn it around as a country, perhaps only very temporarily. So that's why I would say that compared to the Middle East and North Africa, Malaysia is definitely more relatable to pluralistic nationalism, but it's by no means a pure example of it. And of the three countries in the region that we studied, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Malaysia was the least pluralistic nationalism of the three. Indonesia was more so, and India was more so, but all three have been heading for the last couple of decades towards a more majoritarian nationalism direction. So in that sense, if you like, Malaysia, far from being exceptional, is to some extent ahead of the curve, ahead of an undesirable curve, compared to its regional neighbors. So, of course, I would want to emphasize and strengthen the possibility of a more multiculturalist politics, and that's partly why I bring out those principles as I did. See, some people would say, plenty in the academic literature, for instance, say, well, how can you, someone like me, be both a multiculturalist and accept that some countries can have a particular church or a particular religion, a particular deen, given some kind of state precedence? And so I've been trying to say, yes, it is possible, but under certain principled conditions. So I've been trying to develop the principles where it can happen. And so I've kind of managed to reduce them into just two principles. Principle of identification as the lexical priority, but also principle of discretionary recognition permissible as well, as long as we have strong identification as the established. So I want to strengthen what you might call a sophisticated, realistic multiculturalism that is sensitive to different societies' historical trajectories and sensitive to their distinctive, as it were, political difficulties, without kind of saying, oh, well, they're all to be dismissed, they're all negative and so on. So I hope that's some kind of an answer to what you were saying.
Andrew, I'll clear this side first before I go on this side.
Can we take like 2 questions or 3 questions?
Yeah, you can take more than 2, whatever.
Yeah.
The other side might not like the fact that you're trying to clear this side. Thank you very much, Professor Tariq. My name's Andrew Koo, and thank you for replying to my email. I think you did. So I actually have a couple of points, but I'm going to make it very quickly. Firstly, your talk is timely, partly because last year in January, Prime Minister said that secularism was not acceptable to Malaysia. And then in July, when he was asked to explain what he meant by secularism being unacceptable, he went on to say that laïcité secularism was not acceptable. But when you look at laïcité secularism in France, you may say, okay, the hijab is not acceptable, but you have Catholic nuns wearing the habit, and that's totally acceptable. So, and then you say state support for cathedrals. So Notre Dame was burnt down, the state funded the renovations, Right. So what is this laicite, and is it really a false dichotomy that someone like our Prime Minister is trying to create in order to make a distinction without a difference? I suppose that's my first question. And the second question really is, have you looked in your studies and in your research, have you looked at Denmark? Because Denmark has a state religion. Denmark places the Evangelical Lutheran Church in a special position. It gives them a special privileged position, not unlike what's happening in Malaysia in terms of Islam. And it gives tax incentives and things like that. Sure, they try to moderate it by saying, okay, the other religions can apply, but this one gets it automatically, just like in Malaysia. Islam gets it automatically, other religions have to apply. So there is some degree of similarity between how religion is treated in Denmark and in Malaysia. Your comments, thank you.
Right, okay.
No, address this, and then we'll open to group questions. Or maybe. I think wisdom is prevailing because we have a time limit. Okay, two of you on the right. So two, yeah. Line up.
Yeah,
That's it.
Hi.
Prof.
Introduce yourself and then ask
Hi,
the
my name
question.
is Adriana. Prof. Tariq, thank you for your talk. This one was very informative. My question is very simple. Recently, I've been seeing something on social media. Tajikistan, they're a Muslim majority country, but apparently the government is trying to ban all forms of religious outward modes, both for the women and the men. Can you explain how that's happening? It's a Muslim majority country. I find it a very unique situation. Thank you.
Salam sejahtera. Welcome, Prof, to Malaysia. My name is Albia Ahmad. I've been away for a bit in peacekeeping operations, and I am a little concerned that we have not moved for more than 20 years on this issue. I have a concern with your terminology, the democratic process, the democratic dialogue, because that is so contentious. Especially in Malaysia, where the Muslims have not got their act together, that whole Muslim thingamajig has affected the public space for non-Muslims to engage in a reasonable public debate on where the country should go, right? So that is the problem. I love your study in that it has all these principles to guide us, which then I would like to read that. But my concern is the public debate. What would be the factors? What is the structure of that public debate, especially when Muslims want a say and Islam is not accessible to non-Muslims to be able to engage in a coherent democratic debate, right? One of my imams is Abdullahi Ahmad An-Naim, and his book, Islam and the Secular State, or something like that, I've forgotten. He mentioned that for the public debate to happen, there must be principles of civic reason. And part of the information you've given us today, how do we move in a dialogue and so on, would be useful in developing, I think, that the principles for that civic reason. The Muslims will rely on their Islamic principles, fine, but there is an intra-faith debate among Muslims. That is for them to sort out, do not affect other people. If they want to jump in the public debate, that Islamic debate has to be a civic reason, change it by some metamorphosis into a civic reason that is acceptable to all others. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll stop there and then, sorry, for the next round of questions, because he has to leave by noon because he has a flight to catch. But for the next round of questions, please frame it into a question. The khutbah, I'm sorry, I have to. The lecture part of it has to. But I understand. I understand you have to frame the context right. I understand that. So now let Prof answer.
Thank you. I think I've got about 5 questions I managed to take note of, and I'll go through them quickly in the order in which they were raised. So Good to meet you, Andrew, in person. So your two questions. First, about your Prime Minister picking out laïcité, or perhaps he didn't explicitly do so, but you're saying it's probably what he had in mind when he said he's against secularism and secularism is not good for Malaysia. So I said right at the very beginning, is this on? Yeah, yeah. I said right at the very beginning, so we don't follow the idea that there is a paradigmatic secularism. We say there are multiple secularisms. So if someone says, I'm against secularism, the next thing we have to ask is, oh, which secularism are you against? Because it's a bit like saying, I'm against food. I mean, well, what food? So he may be against laïcité. I might be against laïcité, but I'm for secularism of some kind or other. Though I ought to say to you, a lot of people, including some of my own colleagues, say to me, I'm not really a secularist because I concede too much to, as it were, the other side. Denmark. Actually, what Denmark does is so standard in Europe, namely what one might call a hierarchy of recognition. Sometimes it's institutionalized, sometimes it's not institutionalized, it's just a pragmatic development over time. So when you say Malaysia may be a bit like Denmark, yes, actually I think it's a bit more like Britain, because in Denmark, the Lutheran Church has a certain kind of ideological primacy, so that when you ask Danish people, what is it to be Danish? They mention something to do with their church, their faith, quite high up in trying to define the national identity. But the church itself has relatively limited institutional kind of privileges. And in the Church of England has more. So I think actually Malaysia is probably a bit closer to Britain than it is to Denmark in that respect. But obviously that's rather complicated, and I'm trying to keep my answers brief. Tajikistan and the banning of hijabs. Yes, I've been reading about that as well. It is odd, especially when Western Europeans will read this, because they'll think, what the hell? Muslims in Britain and France and so on have been complaining about you Islamophobes, you're banning hijabs, and now look, Tajikistan's doing it. Yeah, they say they're doing it in the name of Islam, or it's at least consistent with their understanding of a certain kind of moderate Islam. I don't think I can say really much more about that. It's a kind of an intra-Muslim debate, but probably it's much more informed by politics and by security issues than it is really by theology. The democratic process, yes, I agree the democratic process can leave a lot to be desired, and my simple appeals to it can leave a lot to be desired as well. I totally agree with you. I also agree with you that we need to be thinking about how we can structure the idea of a democratic process and democratic dialogue. I'm not sure exactly how to do it, but you must include minorities. That's absolutely essential. So institutionally and through the use of the public media, you know, like the BBC in my country, and perhaps you have something similar here, you must make sure that minority voices are heard, because otherwise we end up not with democracy, but with kind of majoritarianism. I actually don't think that Professor An-Naeem's appeal to civic reasons is the way to do it. He obviously, as he himself says, relies very much on John Rawls. And while I respect what John Rawls was trying to do, and he was trying to actually rectify his own earlier position, which was very restrictive towards religion, So he was trying to be a little bit more accommodative. I still think it's a bit too restrictive, because reasons that we give to each other as citizens and in democracy, we shouldn't have to say in advance. We shouldn't restrict in advance what will count as a reason. We should, as it were, suck it and see. We talk to people and they talk to us, and we can find a modus vivendi. We can find forms of dialogue by talking. We shouldn't set a priori limits on what is permissible and what is not. And also John Rawls and Professor Naeem, they both make a very sharp distinction between what is permissible in civil society and what is permissible in, say, a legislature or in a court and so on. And that's, I think, too dichotomous. I don't think that is appropriate. I think we need more fluidity about what counts as a reason. I think I've gone through the questions.
Okay. And then you at the back. And then you're the last one. Helen, you're the last one. Thank you. But keep it short, please.
Yes. Thank you very much, Prof. Learn a lot from you. And I just want to take very snippets only. My main response is this: society is organic. I think that's the key issue. There was one time when we were like this, and then we go this way and we go this way. My friend Siti Kasim was talking. She's having a hard time today. I had a very hard time when I first put on the hijab, because I was in the minority. My group were not, we were dismissed from universities. We had difficulties working because we put on this. So it is organic. I'm not going to go into the debates of it. It's a struggle. But I would also like to emphasize one point. I think part of our problem, to my mind, is we do not really understand differences. You mentioned this. Differences are not just differences, should not be understood as different. But differences must be understood, and to see where they differ, and to appreciate the differences. Mostly we talk about commonness. At the commonness level, of course, we don't fight. So what is there to talk so much about? It is at the level of the differences that we find issues with, and we take differences, and we fight. And I would like to bring what you mentioned, the we. Yeah, I found this a bit, negatively when people talk about tolerance. To me, the word tolerance is a dirty word, because when you tolerate, you don't like it. You are obliged to tolerate. You are forced. If a father tolerates the son, it's not a very happy situation. In Malaysia, we have the word muhibbah. And this is our culture and this is our blood. It is not politicized. It's not the politicians who, they may highlight the word, but they're not the ones who introduce. Great-grandfathers before. And this is where we come with we. Yeah. And in my international discussions, I use the word, explain it as the kinship of humanity. It's not like the other, but like we are. Because this is the right, I think I'll just stop there, because, yeah.
Okay, hello everyone. This is a simple question and it's straightforward. I would like to, the question is regarding the research methodology and the framework that you used in the study. You said that you used comparative political science / sociology. So when we talk about governance, it's very complicated to separate between the government, the leaders, and also the voice from the grassroots. What is the weightage that you put on the society, for the society, in your studies? Because, for example, what I knew in the past about India, for example, there's a heavy dilemma of the social strata or the social caste. Is that still happening? And to what extent does control of religion play the part there in the societal, Indian society? Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, Helen, last one.
Thank you, Professor Tariq Modood, for your presentation. I think I'm very appreciative of the approach that is from empirical and then engaging with the theoretical. But somehow you did not elaborate or give any case study on liberal neutralism. So would you mind giving one or two examples? And second question is, when you talk about multicultural secularism, your reference, is it closer to what you mean by liberal neutralism cases? And if not, how does it differ?
Great. Thank you very much. So again, I'll just rapidly go through responding in the order that you asked me these questions. So I entirely agree with you. The issue is about difference. And that's why I was saying, and I think this resonates with what you were saying as well, that the experience of certain Asian countries, and actually I think also certain Middle Eastern countries, and it's to some extent related to Muslim societies, you know, including like the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman millets, that there is a much more historical, evolved experience of living with difference than is to be found in the contemporary West. The contemporary West is facing it now, but it's something that other societies have lived and worked various solutions over a much longer period of time. But they've done it without democracy, and they've done it without citizenship. And the real juncture that we are in today with multiculturalism is that we are having to think about difference in the context of democratic equality and democratic citizenship. And that is new. Most historic societies that have lived well with difference have been hierarchical societies where democracy was not present. So, but I certainly think that when we talk about difference, as so many people now do in the West, we must also talk about commonness. It's not one against the other. There's no such thing as difference if there isn't some commonality. Difference only makes sense if we can talk about commonality, just as darkness only makes sense if we can talk about light, and so on. They're correlative terms. And actually, we have to cultivate both respect for difference and our commonalities together. And so perhaps your kinship humanity resonates with that. I've got to be honest, I didn't really understand exactly what you were asking me, and perhaps you were asking me more than one thing, and that's why I wasn't sure. You said you were asking me about something about my methodology and about governance, and then did I hear you say what was my message to society, or did I mishear that? I don't know. So I'm not sure what to say to you because I'm not sure exactly what your question was, but I wouldn't like you to go completely without an answer, so perhaps if you come up to the front just as I'm dashing to the door.
Can you say from there what you meant by that?
It's actually how you separate the roles of the ruler and the voices from the
I see. Okay, right. Yeah. So in a kind of democratic process, you have to have voices from below. But we mustn't romanticize the idea that democracy is just about voices from below. Democracy is about the rule of law, about institutions, about electing a government that then makes policies and carries them out and so on. So in that sense, if you like, democracy is a multi-leveled politics. It's not just below or at the top. I quite like the middle myself. But, you know, it's the interaction between all these levels. And I think in a country like mine, Britain, our multiculturalism has definitely been pushed by political activism from below, from people who have what we call skin in the game, people who have an existential issue with discrimination and Islamophobia and not being accepted as equal or as British. And so we fight against that. But if we were the only people that were in favor of it, nothing would happen. Obviously, we need to win people over. We need to win the majority over. We mustn't let it remain a minority's issue. We need to win political parties over. We need to get them elected into government. We need to make sure they make the right policies and so on. So it's a multi-tiered political project, as any major political project has to be. So I hope that answers your question. Yes, liberal neutralism, that's interesting. The reason I didn't say much about liberal neutralism is because none of our 26 countries had liberal neutralism or even approximated to it really. Maybe one or two slightly, possibly like Australia, but not really. So in my mind, the only country that comes anywhere close to liberal neutralism on the globe is the United States, because it says, as a constitutional amendment, you know, that there has to be no establishment. And the state should not be involved in favoring any one religion relative to another, and so on. So whether it completely carries that out or not, I'll leave to one side, but no other country in the world does anything remotely similar. All countries, all states are involved in regulating religion, in favoring one kind of religion over another, in supporting religion, in outlawing religion, and so on. So liberal neutralism is almost an impossible ideal, and especially as by neutralism, I mean what philosophers call hands-off neutralism. So for those of you not familiar with the term, hands-off means that the government doesn't do anything. It doesn't put its hands on society. It keeps its hands off. There are other accounts of neutralism which say they are hands-on neutralism, but then they have to specify some principle that determines when the hands should be on and when the hands should be off and so on. I don't necessarily mean them in neutralism, but anyway, I think that when you said, what's the relationship between liberal neutralism and multicultural secularism? So liberal neutralism, like all liberalism, is mainly about individuals. Because for liberals, the highest good is the individual. Well, that's obviously not true for multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is about individuals, but it's also about groups. Multiculturalism is not about anti-state intervention. It requires state intervention in order to create a multicultural society and to sustain it. The state must be actively involved. But, and this relates to the previous answer, it's not a state project in terms of a top-down project. There must be a bottoms-up movement, a bottoms-up demand. But the state has to sometimes lead it, especially at the time when we have right-wing backlashes like we do at the moment, populism and so on. So we need state leadership as well as bottoms-up political activism, and none of that can be left to simply liberalism or simply a kind of limited state philosophy. If anything, multiculturalism requires more intervention by the state, not less. So the important thing is, what are the principles governing state intervention and limiting and circumscribing state intervention, but we mustn't be anti-statist. I think I'll have to stop there.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think for the interest of time, since Prof has to leave now.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. I would like to thank Prof. Zermain and Dr. K.J. John for collaborating with us in holding this event. I know there are so many burning questions, but we leave it for another day. Thank you everyone for coming and participating with us. Thank you, and I hope to see you again.
If you'd like a physical voucher, you can have one from me.
Yeah.